Hey guys, today I show you how I built this modern side table. So I begin this project by breaking down the plywood for the table. Since the sides and the top are the same width, I cut those first at the table saw to 15 3/4 of an inch. Next, I reposition the table saw fence and cut the panel that's below the drawers, which is 3/4 of an inch narrower at 15 inches. And finally, I reposition the fence to 10 inches and cut the bottom shelf. With the panels cut to width, I can now focus on cutting them to length using my crosscut sled. So to begin, I first clean up one edge. And then I set up a stop block at 46.5 inches and cut the top panel, middle panel, and bottom shelf to length. The crosscut sled with the stop block ensures that the panels are going to be the same exact length. Next, I reset the stop block to 31 inches and cut both of the legs to length. The final pieces to cut before assembling the casework are the drawer dividers. I first start by cutting those to 6 inches in width. And then using the crosscut sled with the stop block, I cut them to 14 3/4 in length. Next, I cut the design elements and the legs. I begin by making a mark 3 inches from the sides and 1.5 inch from the bottom. Before drilling the starter holes, I clamp a board to the bottom of the leg to prevent tear out while drilling. And I drill 2 starter holes using a 3/8 of an inch brad point bit. This is the hole that the jigsaw will go down when removing the waste. While removing the waste, I stay 1/8 of an inch away from the line because I'm going to use a trim router and a flush trim bit to clean the lines up. Like I just mentioned, I used a 1/2 inch flush trim bit and some scrap plywood to clean up the cut left by the jigsaw and to give me some nice straight lines. And as you can see, the legs now look perfect. I use shop grade maple plywood for this project, so that means there are some knots and some voids that I have to cover with wood filler before assembling the table. Since this is a painted project, this is a nice way to save a few bucks on the plywood that you choose. And finally, before assembling, I sanded all of the plywood panels with 180 and 220 grit sandpaper using my random orbit sander. This not only got all the surfaces ready for paint, but it also removed the wood filler from the previous steps. And using the same 180 and 220 grit sandpaper, I also sanded the edges as they will be getting paint as well. To join all of the parts in this project, I will be using the Kreg pocket hole jig. It's a fast and secure way to assemble the table and the drawers. I begin by drilling 4 holes on each end of the top and the middle panels. To help hold the legs vertically, I placed the pieces in pipe clamps and clamped them in place. I also used a couple of quick clamps to make sure that the top of the legs and the top of the top panel are flush. Since I'm using 3/4 inch material, I used 1 1/4 inch screws for the table and the drawers. Now that the top is flush with the legs, I put the screws in. Next, I put the other leg in place, making sure it's flush, and then I put the screws in. I also install the drawer dividers with pocket hole screws. On one side of the dividers, I mark for 2 pocket holes, and on the other side, I drill 1 pocket hole at the center of the board. To mark the placement of the dividers, I make a mark 15 inches from the inside edge of the leg on both sides. Using a combination square, I ensure that the drawer dividers were square to the edge of the middle panel, and then I clamped it into place. And finally, I install the screws. Even though no one will ever see the pocket holes, I wanted to hide them before painting. So to fill the holes, I used some wood filler. Next, I attach the middle panel to the drawer dividers by countersinking 2 screws into each divider, and then I attach the panel to the legs with the pocket hole screws. To attach the bottom shelf, I first drill 3 pocket holes on each end of the panel. To make the installation of the bottom shelf a little easier, I clamped a 17 3/4 inch spacer to the legs that the bottom shelf will sit on while installing the screws. After placing the shelf on the spacers, I used a combination square set to 2 7/8 to set the spacing from the front edge of the table. I then installed the 6 pocket hole screws. Now I begin cutting the plywood for the drawers. I cut the drawer sides to width at the table saw to 5.5 inches. I cut all of the drawer sides at the same time to ensure that they are the same exact width. Using my crosscut sled, I set up a stop block at 12.5 inches to cut the shorter drawer sides to length. Using the stop block ensures that all of the pieces are the same exact length, and it gives you repeatability. Next, I reset the stop block to 14 3/4 of an inch and cut the longer drawer sides to length. Over at the router table, I route a 1/4 inch groove that is a 1/4 inch deep for the bottom panel using my 1/4 inch spiral bit. Switching over to a 1/4 inch plywood, I cut the drawer bottoms to size at the table saw by first cutting them to 13 inches wide. And using the crosscut sled, I cut all 3 drawer bottoms to 13 3/4 of an inch long. The drawer fronts get 2 pocket holes on each end to attach to the drawer sides. Assembling the drawers can be a little tricky, so I began by first putting the drawer bottom in 2 of the drawer sides, and then carefully placed it in a couple of clamps to help hold the drawer into place while attaching the other 2 panels. I then put in the pocket hole screws. To install the drawer slides, I set my combination square to 2 1/4 inches and used it as a reference for locating and installing the drawer slides. The front of the drawer slides are flush with the front of the drawer. With the drawer slides reinstalled, I use an 1/8 inch shim under my combination square to measure for a template that I can use for repeatability. The measurement of the combination square is the width of the template. The template is set back a 1/16 of an inch from the edge. The drawer slide sets on top of the template while I install the 3 screws. For this project, I installed 14 inch soft close drawer slides. Next, I cut the 3/4 inch walnut drawer fronts to 6 3/4 of an inch wide at the table saw. Then, I cut each drawer front to length only after measuring the opening at the table. Next, I pre-drilled 1/8 inch holes for the screws that attach the drawer fronts to the drawer boxes. To get the correct placement of the drawer fronts, I first put some double-sided tape on the drawer boxes to temporarily attach the drawer fronts. Using 1/16 inch shims, I evenly spaced the drawer front. Next, I push on the drawer front to make sure it's contacting the tape and slowly open the drawer. With the drawer open, I install the 2 screws. Instead of using hardware for the drawer pulls, I put a cove on the inside bottom edge of the drawer fronts using my cove bit at the router table. The final piece to cut was the back panel. I began by cutting it to 6 inches wide. And then using my miter gauge, I cut it to 46.5 inches long. Before applying the varnish to the drawer fronts, I first sanded them all the way up to 220 grit using my orbital sander. General Finishes was kind enough to send me a few products to use on this table. I began by first applying 2 coats of the stain blocker primer using a foam roller. After the first coat of primer dried, I sanded with 320 grit sandpaper and then applied a second coat. To remove the dust that was created from sanding in between coats, I just used a damp paper towel. After the second coat of primer, I applied the first coat of snow white milk paint, again using a foam roller. After the first coat of paint dried, I sanded with 320 grit sandpaper and applied the second and final coat. To protect the paint and to give it a little sheen, I applied 2 coats of this semi-gloss high performance top coat. I applied it with the foam roller, and like before, I sanded in between coats using the 320 grit sandpaper. Since I'm using walnut for the drawer fronts, I wanted to use an oil-based finish to pop the grain, so I applied 3 coats of a semi-gloss armor seal just using a cotton cloth. After each coat of the varnish, I sanded the surface with 320 grit sandpaper, and to remove the dust, I used a tack cloth. With the drawers reinstalled, the last step was to install the back panel. I nailed it to the back of the drawer dividers using my brad nailer. Overall, I love the modern design of this table. The color of the milk paint in contrast to the walnut drawer fronts is also a nice touch. The continuous grain on the drawer fronts was also one of my favorite parts of the project, as it just makes the drawer fronts look like one big piece. And speaking of the drawer fronts, I wanted to keep the look of this table very minimal, so instead of installing hardware, I really like the cove that I routed on the back side of the drawer fronts. I'm really happy with this project and I want to hear what you think. Leave me a comment below, and if you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button and share this with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks guys.